Hello, fellow bakers. Welcome to another session of Oh Yum 101 Live. And today's tutorial is all about pie dough. And I can tell by the questions just coming in now and that I've seen on the community here at Oh Yum and on my social media that you are excited about this topic. You also have lots of questions. You're asking a lot of questions in common, and so I think throughout this tutorial, I will be able to cover all of them. I'll check in on the thread whenever I possibly can, whenever my hands aren't too buttery. So let's jump right into pie dough. Now, in North America, let me back up first. Hello to everyone who's joining me, who joins me regularly. Of course, my mom and dad and me. Hello, Kathy. Hello, T. Hello, Bonnie. You know the drill. And welcome to all the new viewers. You are actually watching me live. Okay, back to pie dough. Now, pie dough is typically the term used to describe the North American style of pie. Pie dough used for fruit pies, for cream pies, and custard pies, as opposed to a different style like a pasta frolla, which is more of a sweet dough. This is a savory dough. It can be used for savory pies, just like a meat pie or a quiche if you wanted to. It's buttery, it's flaky, it's tender. And I think before I jump into it, what a lot of people, when they learn how to make a fruit pie, if they've been taught by another family member, it may be that you've been taught how to make pie dough in negatives. So don't let the butter get warm. Don't add too much water. Don't overwork the dough. Don't let it get warm when you're rolling it. So all these don'ts add up to what my friend Jennifer calls FOP, fear of pastry. So we get so scared with all these rules of don't do this, don't do that. I want to show you how to make pie dough using positives. This is what you can do. This is what you will find. These are some great options. So we are going to start using a mixer, and I know I gave the proportions ahead of time, so if you're baking along, you can do this by hand using a pastry blender. Even 2 knives will work. You can use electric beaters. Don't use the whip setting, use the beater setting to cut in your ingredients. But unlike a cookie dough, you start with the dry ingredients first and you work in the cool butter. So I have 2.5 cups, 450 grams of all-purpose flour already in my mixing bowl. Now, I'm going to add 1 tablespoon. That's only 12 grams of sugar. And I did see one of you bakers ask me, well, can you make this recipe without the sugar? Yes, you can. Because the sugar here is not for the sweetness, but it actually has a function. So you may change your mind and decide to add the sugar. That little bit of sugar added to this recipe helps to interrupt the protein development within the flour, because part of making a tender and flaky pie dough that doesn't shrink when it bakes is to make sure that those proteins in the flour are nicely relaxed. So that is the function for that little bit of sugar. I am also going to add a teaspoon of fine salt. And that is simply for flavor, just like in cooking. And you'll notice that when I bake, I use unsalted butter. And I'm going to touch on why in just a second. There we go. I just stirred that together. Now, there are lots of different ways to approach making a pie dough. And one of the things I think we stumble on is we worry about how much water to add at the end, but that relates to the process at the beginning. If you overhydrate, if too much liquid gets into your flour, then you end up with a stretchy dough. That's great if you're making pizza, not if you're making a fruit pie. So I have found that by adding 3 tablespoons of vegetable oil before I add my butter, and I mix that in, and there's nothing visible to see when you mix it in, you just combine it in, that's coating each granule of flour just a little bit. So when it comes time to add the water, it won't jump into the flour and create that stretchiness that makes for a tough crust. So 3 tablespoons, the equivalent is 45 milliliters. You can use any kind of, you want a neutral oil, so not olive oil, because this dough has to be chilled and olive oil gets all grainy and congealed when it sets up. but a neutral tasting vegetable oil, whatever you have on hand will work. And you'll see why as I get now to the next step. So there was nothing noticeably different about the dough, but now it's time to add butter. So this recipe for pie dough is based on the French style of savory pie dough called pâte brisée. And it's a butter-based pastry. You know I'm a butter girl. But we're going to talk about some other options too. So this is 1 cup, 225 grams of unsalted butter. And I mentioned salt earlier because the reason I use unsalted butter, yet I add salt to my recipe, is because I can be in charge of the salt. Brand for brand, when it comes to salted butter, you don't know how much salt you're getting per gram in your butter. Recipe for recipe, your salt requirements vary. And I find sometimes when you've got a recipe that calls for a good quantity of butter, like this recipe, 225 grams, the salt within the butter can overwhelm the recipe. So I'd rather be in charge. I also find that unsalted butter is sweeter and fresher tasting, and it just really speaks to that end result. When you slice into that pie and you get that sort of crisp little shatter as the pie crust kind of breaks into those flaky pieces and yielding to that fruit filling, it's really worth using the unsalted butter. Now, have you noticed I didn't grab this butter from the refrigerator? This butter is not ice cold. I have found that cutting up my butter and letting it sit out for 15 minutes to 30 minutes, and it really depends on the temperature of where you live. I know we've got people watching from Portugal right now, from Argentina, from Philippines, all over the world. So depending on which side of the hemisphere and where you are, the weather might be different. On a hot and humid day, I would cut up the butter and let it sit out 10 minutes. The key is it does not have to be ice cold. And think about it. When you've got ice cold butter going into your flour, to break up into even pieces and so that you don't overwork it, if it's ice cold, it's going to take longer and it will break down unevenly. So you'll get those big hunks and then little pieces, and you're more at risk of overworking your flour. So I say pull the butter out a little bit sooner, especially if you're making it by hand. You'll find the butter works in more evenly, more quickly, and it just makes perfect sense. And you're not compromising the end result. So we've got our flour protected by that coating of vegetable oil, and now I'm working in the butter. I'm doing this on low speed, and this gives me a moment to chat about other options in place of butter. If you grew up or grew up with a family member's fruit pies and they were made using shortening or lard, and you love that flavor, you certainly can do that. And I've got a great little tip for you. So the thing to remember, if you want to take this recipe and instead of use butter, use shortening or lard, you would use the same amount, but you would skip the trick of adding the vegetable oil. Instead, what you would do is take 3 tablespoons of that shortening or lard, melt it, add it to the flour first, and then add your remaining diced shortening and lard. And the reason for that is butter, and I can speak to Canadian butter specifically, is 80% butter fat. That means there's 20% milk solids, basically water, in with the butter, where lard and shortening, or coconut oil for that matter, are 100% fat. So by pulling that three tablespoons out, melting it and adding it first, you get your same fat to flour ratio without compromising the end result. Some people like using shortening or lard because it stays constant at room temperature where butter can become soft. So if your comfort is using that, I welcome that. If you want to phase into butter, try a 50-50 replacement. So let's check out, we're going to have Michael zoom in now, our flour mixture. So you can see now it's crumbly and there's some little bits of butter working in there, but it's already starting to soften up a little bit. And this is the point where I stop mixing because now we're adding the liquid, and this is what's going to bring the pie dough together. So it's another opportunity to blend it. And this actually brings up a good point. Fatima was asking about a gluten-free pie crust option, and you will find the complete recipe for my flourless pear and cranberry pie right here on the Oh Yum channel, and it's got all the proportions for a gluten-free crust. I rely on brown rice flour and tapioca starch as the sort of structure of the dough itself. I still add the butter, but in place of adding water, I add egg whites. And Fatima, what that does is it lends protein to a gluten-free crust so that when it bakes, it holds the fruit filling in and it sets up with a nice crispness to it. You still have to handle it delicately when you roll it, but I hope you give that recipe a try. Okay, back to adding the liquids. Now, this is another great conversation, and I saw all your questions come rolling in. So many pie dough recipes call for a range of liquid to add. Add 6 to 10 tablespoons, add a quarter to a half cup. Well, since when do we have a baking recipe that gives you that many options? And how are you supposed to know how much water to add? So I have decided in the, dare I say, thousands of pies I've made over the many years. Michael's saying 5 and 10,000 pies. I've decided to commit to an amount of water to add to the pie dough. This is a big deal for bakers. You know it's a big deal. No more guesswork. I have found for this recipe, a quarter cup of cool water is the right amount to add. And this is where having cool butter and cool water, it doesn't have to be ice cold butter. And for this pie dough recipe, your water doesn't have to be ice cold. You don't have to put ice cubes in it and strain it out. Everything is kind of on an even cool temperature. So we're committing to a quarter cup of cool water, but we're going to give ourselves a nice tool, 2 teaspoons of lemon juice. This has nothing to do with the flavor of the pie crust at all. This is adding acidity to the pie dough. And what acidity does when it comes in contact with wheat flour is it allows the proteins within the flour to become more relaxed and elastic. So when you're rolling your pie dough, you'll find it won't shrink back on you. And when you bake it, you won't lose that crust sinking into the bottom of your pie shell. So we're going to add this all at once. And then this is the point where you mix it until the dough comes together. Now, a question I think I did see pop up once was, what if you wanted to use a food processor to make this? You could use a food processor. This is where I would say then keep your butter cold, because the friction of that high-speed blaze in the food processor will work that butter into your dough very quickly. So there always has to be one exception to a rule. So you can see the dough is a bit shaggy looking at this point. This is where I like to stop mixing it because I still am going to come in contact with it to shape it, unwrap it, and chill it. How's everyone doing? If you're making this along with me, how are you feeling about your dough? If you're mixing the butter in by hand, it will take a little bit longer. Just gonna get my mixer out of the way as I usually do. Just tuck it down here and hopefully not trip on it. Oh, very good question. Can you use vinegar in place of lemon juice? 100%. Any sort of neutral acidity, I wouldn't use balsamic vinegar or your fancy raspberry vinegar, but vinegar works absolutely fine. Great, great question. All right, I'll be right back. Can you tell I love making pastry? It is honestly one of my favorite things to do. I think fruit pies in general, I just find so gratifying. So you will see as I flatten out this dough, there are still tiny little pieces, not a lot, but just a few. If you see streaks of butter or a couple small pieces, don't try and knead or work them out because you're going to have that opportunity when you're rolling your dough out to line your pie shell for your fruit pie filling. So now, something to consider. I had someone ask a great question yesterday. Can I use this pie dough for individual or mini tarts? Yes, you can. So if I'm making a recipe for something like a butter tart, which if you're not Canadian and you don't know what a butter tart is, it's a very Canadian dessert, it's kind of like a gooey pecan tart with fewer pecans and more goo. And that works, this pie dough recipe works brilliantly. So instead of shaping into 2 discs, I shape them into 2 logs, and that way I cut my single tart shell portions and roll them out individually. That way I'm not re-rolling my dough excessively. But for the sake of this fruit pie, we're going to shape it into 2 discs. And if you happen to remember, and I rarely do, if you want to do a lattice top pie, I try and roughly shape one of those discs actually more into a square because it's easier to get a nice even lattice cut. And you'll see when it's time to roll that dough. So this will be the bottom of the shell. This will be the top. You can wrap in paper, reusable parchment. I reuse my plastic wrap all the time. And now we need to chill this. And it's less about the warmth of the butter. It's the fact that in working this dough, we've exercised the glutens, the proteins in the flour, and that has made it stretchy. And if we were to try and roll and bake this crust right now, it would come out tough. So this is a great point. If you want to freeze, you can freeze these and then pull them out in the fridge to thaw overnight the day before you want to make your pie. You can chill them. These will keep for days in the fridge, but you want to give them at least 2 hours to chill. And isn't it handy? I happen to have some already chilled. Now here's something interesting. I have pulled these 2 that I made last night out of the fridge. I am not quite ready to roll my pastry. I want to show you, we're going to go into the whole fruit filling topic in just a few minutes. But when it comes to rolling pastry, just like the butter I mixed into the dough itself, I pull it out a little bit ahead of time before I roll it. A lot of people ask, I know, I saw it on your feed. A lot of people were asking about pastry cracking when you roll it. Well, anything with, it could be the best recipe on the planet, but if you've got ice cold butter in your dough, it doesn't matter what you do, it will crack a little bit because it's ice cold butter. So I always equate it to thinking about how you put butter on your toast in the morning. And if you're from Southeast Asia, if you're making kaya toast, oh my God, I love kaya toast. That little knob of butter right in the center with the coconut jam. Anyhow, okay, back to pie dough. If you make toast for breakfast in the morning and you try and spread ice cold butter on top, what happens? It cracks and it shatters. You're pressing harder, you're overworking it, and you end up getting a hole in your toast, and then you're grumpy all day because you had not nice toast. If you have slightly softened butter, when you spread it, you get that nice even layer, it spreads easily, and then you're in a good mood the rest of the day. So that's how I think about pie dough. Now, you don't want it to fully come up to room temperature. That's just too soft. But in the time it takes me to make my fruit filling, this will be ready to roll. So let's move on. I did see a note pop up earlier, and I see it repeated again, asking about using ground almonds. It does rather become a different recipe when you start replacing the foundation flour with different ingredients. So I would prefer not to give you a one-to-one substitution to use ground almonds because typically a ground almond pastry dough has a little more sugar to it and usually the addition of an egg. So before I get into the fruit filling, that was another question I saw pop up repeatedly. Do you add egg to a pie dough recipe? I have in the past, but one of the challenges if you add egg to a recipe like this, such simple ingredients, essentially flour with a touch of sugar and salt, but butter and water, is the egg it will lend a souffle action as the pie shell bakes, and you'll find you lose some of the character on your pie crust. So if you did a beautiful fluted edges, the egg will actually expand that fluted edge and you'll lose that profile, that beautiful shape to it. And you may not get quite the crunch and crispness that you will get if you were to just use water with that little bit of lemon juice or vinegar. So that was an excellent question to throw in there. I see a question coming in. Flour is hard to come by these days. What else can you use? As I said, you look at actually creating a different style of recipe if you're steering away from wheat flour. If you want the gluten-free option using rice flour, check out my pear cranberry pie recipe right here on the OYum channel, and you'll get the proportions there. You can make this recipe using whole wheat flour, if you wish, up to 50%. And I think it's delicious using whole wheat flour. And it suits fillings with a bit of spice, like an apple pie or a pumpkin pie, because when the whole wheat flour bakes, it takes on kind of a nice nutty characteristic to it. Okay, let's get right into the filling. You voted for a peach pie filling. Wow! Which gives me a great opportunity to talk about fresh fruit versus frozen fruit, a cooked filling versus a fresh filling. And I want to walk you through quite a few of you asked about strawberry rhubarb pie, because here in Canada, that's what's in season right now. But the first thing I want to do is get my peaches cooking. Because peaches aren't in season where I live here in Canada, I have to wait until August until those. I am using frozen peaches. They're still local, but they're frozen and thawed. So, what you want to have after thawing is 750 grams of frozen peaches. So, instead of weighing them before you thaw them, pull it. And I will tell you, you will need extra because as you thaw them, you'll find you get water dripping away from the peaches, and you want to strain that off. Don't rinse the peaches, but drain away the excess water. Because what happens when fruit freezes is the water within it crystallizes, the cells sort of loosen up a little bit as the fruit thaws, and it releases some of the water. But part of the reason we are cooking our this filling is because I don't want you to have a watery pie. I find a peach pie can be challenging a little bit because it can those peaches can have so much liquid, and it actually dilutes the peach flavor a little bit. So I have found with frozen peaches, I prefer to cook the filling. And even if I'm making an apple pie, I like to cook down my apples, half of them, a little bit to let some of that excess liquid evaporate. I'm going to get into berries and other fruits in just a few minutes, but to start this peach filling, so this is 750 grams of frozen peaches that have been thawed and drained, but you can still see there's liquid in that. Don't worry, we have a chance for it to cook away. So I've got this large saute pan on high heat, and I am adding half a cup, so 100 grams of sugar. A lot of traditional fresh fruit pies call for a cup of sugar. And when you're making a fruit pie, the sugar in the filling is really about the sweetness in the fruit, balancing with the added sugar, and it is to taste. You can't replace or change the sugar within a cake recipe or a cookie recipe and expect the same result, but you can in a pie filling. So taste your fruit, decide how sweet it is, but take that starting point of what the recipe calls for and then decide if you want a little more or a little less. In addition to my 100 grams or half a cup of sugar, would help if I turned on the right burner, I'm adding 3 tablespoons of whipping cream. Now, this is something I came up with years ago and I absolutely adore because we're essentially going to create a bit of a caramel sauce in the pan with the peach juices melding and concentrating. So it's really going to add a depth of flavor that doesn't overwhelm the peaches, but it just kind of heightens their flavor. You could do this with an apple pie filling just as easily. And I saw some wonderful notes come in right before we went live asking about different fruit options. And of course, depending on where you live, you have different fruits available to you. So the typical North American fruits, the berries, cherries, raspberries, blueberries, apple, cranberry, um, all have a balance of sweetness and acidity. So there are some fruits that don't suit being baked in a pie like this on their own. And that would include pear on its own is not so flavorful. Add something tart like raspberries or cranberries, pooh, all of a sudden it's delicious. Melons, cantaloupe, honeydew, not so good in a fruit pie. They're best enjoyed fresh. Mangoes could work, but they can toughen up sometimes, as could bananas. Bananas are best used fresh. And in a North American style fruit pie, you would put them under a custard layer or maybe torched or bruleed on top. So there are lots of different options. And of course, so many variations on a fruit pie, no matter what your culture is or what country you live in. Fruit desserts are always so welcome and delicious. And I know when I travel, I enjoy trying all of them. And I love seeing fruit like bananas and melons and mangoes integrated into desserts, like the Malaysian kueh, that are just so, so delicious and interesting. So I still have my pan on high heat. Can you see all that liquid that is coming out of the peaches? Those were thawed, and still all that liquid is coming out. This is why I'm cooking it, because I don't want you to slice into your pie and have that puddle of liquid come out. So we're concentrating the peach flavor. All that's evaporating is water. That's it. And that's why I only start with half a cup or 100 grams of sugar, because everything else is going to be concentrated, including the natural peach sweetness. So this takes about 8 minutes, and I stir it occasionally. And towards the last 2 minutes, when you see very little liquid, I'll turn down the heat just a degree so I don't scorch the peaches. But we're going to see the sugar caramelize just at the bottom of the pan a touch. So while this is cooking, this is a great opportunity to talk about some other fruit fillings, including bakers. I know you were asking for strawberry rhubarb pie. If you're preparing a fresh fruit filling of any variety, could be strawberry rhubarb, it could be a fresh blueberry or a fresh raspberry, you want to start with 6 cups of fruit. I generally add 1 cup or the 200 grams of granulated sugar. And then the key to prevent that sort of puddle of liquid at the bottom of the pie is adding 3 tablespoons of tapioca starch, or tapioca flour, it's called. It's a key ingredient in gluten-free baking. If you can't find the actual fine tapioca starch or flour, you can use what's called minute tapioca. It's that fine granule of instant tapioca, but you only need 2 tablespoons of that. Now, tapioca starch, as opposed to adding flour, which stays stodgy and kind of cloudy looking in a fruit pie, or cornstarch, which has to hit 212 in the center of the pie to activate. You end up overcooking your pie. Tapioca starch doesn't need to get that hot to fully activate and thicken those juices. So that's why I like to use 6 cups of fruit. And in strawberry rhubarb, I use 3 cups of strawberry, 3 cups of rhubarb, 1 cup or 200 grams of sugar, and 3 tablespoons of tapioca flour. I stir the tapioca starch into the sugar, stir it into the fruit right before I'm ready to assemble the pie. That can apply to blueberries and raspberries. I will give you a little hint. I usually like to peel and coarsely grate an apple into a blueberry or raspberry pie, because you know those berries are so fragile and delicate, they'll cook right down to nothing. That one apple absorbs some of the juices, and also there's pectin in the apple, which will help set it, and you won't end up with such a flat pie. But still, the same rule, the 6 cups of fruit applies. Then you have your cooked fillings. So a traditional cherry or blueberry pie means you can use frozen fruit. You pre-cook it. Again, you would add 1 cup of sugar. And what you would do is bring that up to a full simmer. You can add lemon zest or another flavor if you wish. But then you stir 2.5 tablespoons of cornstarch with a little bit of water until it makes a paste. That's called a slurry. You add that to your simmering fruit. Let it come back to a full simmer, because cornstarch needs to hit a full simmer. You'll see it goes glossy. You set it aside, you chill it, and you're ready to use it. So that works for blueberries and cherries most effectively. So I don't know if you can hear, the simmering peaches are getting noisier because the water is evaporating. And they're smelling good. Are they smelling good, Michael? Yes. Some great color. As a note, peaches, when you buy them frozen, have already been blanched, because they blanch them after picking so that they peel easily. And then they turn them into the slices just like this. So while I started with about 6, maybe even a bit more of frozen peaches, once I thawed them and then cooked them down, I end up with 4 cups at the very end. If you're making a fruit pie, you have more fruit because it will cook down as it bakes. But once this all the liquid evaporates, this won't reduce anymore when you make your fruit pie, which is also a great tip. As I said, it applies to apples, because if you've ever had that gap between your top crust of your pie and the fruit, that's because the fruit has cooked down. So taking time to do this step uh, with half of your apples or all of your peaches in this case, you'll find you won't get that gap. How's everyone doing? Good? I'm getting a little steamy in here. A lot of water coming off of these peaches. Okay. Oh, this is a good question from Miriam. Hot place, hot ingredients. Yeah, things can get sticky, and especially if you've got humidity. So you have to start reading your ingredients and feeling the climate. And so if it means instead of pulling your butter from the fridge half an hour before or 20 minutes before, maybe you only have to do it 5 minutes before, or by the time that you cut up your butter, it has softened enough. And then I would work on a slightly higher speed if you're using beaters, and just stop mixing that much sooner, because every step when you add an ingredient is another opportunity to mix. All right, we're starting to get a little bit of caramelization. You can see it's pulling away from the pan. I know Michael's going to zoom in on there, and you can see this liquid is getting a little bit thicker. Now it's bubbling hot right now, so it's fluid, but as it cools, it will thicken up a little bit. And all of a sudden, the smell of the sugar has changed a little bit. A hint of caramelization, but I still get that peachy goodness coming from this. So when I do see it starting to stick at the bottom of the pan, just like so, I'll just turn off the heat. And it is very important to let this filling cool completely before you use it in your pie dough. A hot filling on top of making all that work you went to make that beautiful pastry dough, it would melt the butter within the pastry and you'd end up with a soft bottom to your pie, which we don't want. So the good news is we don't have to wait. I have a peach filling already done and cooled. I made this morning. So the peaches will contract a little bit and that color intensifies. But the combination of that little bit of cream with the sugar is just so nice. So now I'm going to set this aside because it's time to roll the pie dough. So another set of things to consider as we roll along. Which one is bigger? Which one is going to be the bottom? Smaller one. This one. So let's take a moment, because I know I have seen questions come in about baking pans. And I find when it comes to making a fruit pie, the material of your pan makes a big difference. So you've got a couple of options. You've got glass, metal, you have ceramic or porcelain, and silicone. When it comes to making a conventional fruit pie, I prefer using glass, hands down. A pie plate has the angles so you can get your spatula in easily to lift out the tart. If all you have is a fluted straight-sided pan, it will work. You might want to wrap the outside of the pan in foil in case there is a little fruit leaking through. The reason I like to use a glass pie plate is because glass heats up really quickly and it holds the heat. And that's exactly what I want, because I want this pie dough to set in place before the wet fruit filling has a chance to seep through. So that's the whole reason. Metal heats up quickly and it cools down quickly. So as a second choice option, I would pick metal. Ceramic takes a long time to heat up, and you'll find your crust just won't brown. You'll get that soft center. It looks pretty going on the table, but you just don't get the best bake out of your fruit pie crust. And silicone doesn't brown at all. But I can't say I've even seen a silicone pie plate in this shape, so we won't even go there. But glass is ideal because it does heat up. It's also why I don't like using a glass pan when I'm making something delicate like a lemon square or a brownie, because it can overcook the outside before the inside has had a chance to thaw. Okay, so we're going to roll out our pie dough. You don't grease your pan because we don't want that pastry dough sliding down into the bottom of the pan. But I do like to put a nice sprinkling of flour on the bottom of the pan. It just creates that barrier that when it comes time to lift out your slices, it's easier to do. So my dough is still cold. Light flouring on my work surface. Little flouring on my rolling pin. Don't need to use a cold rolling pin or anything fancy like that. I do find I like rolling on wood when it comes to pie pastry. Wood holds an even temperature. And so hot or cold weather. To my viewers, many who are writing about the hot climate issues, now that is when maybe a marble board can come in handy because marble stays cooler longer. So you might find when it comes to this step, you have more luck. So I start with small motions. And you know how annoying it can be to get that crack forming in the middle of the crust as you start rolling? Well, having the dough just slightly softened is helping to prevent that. But don't be afraid to flip your dough over and check, because sometimes as you start rolling on this side, it looks smooth, because this is where the rolling pin is making contact with your dough. But if you see a crack developing on the other side, you just flip it over and start rolling, and you'll find the crack will heal itself. So you can see with this recipe, just soften slightly. What was that, about 15 minutes? We're not seeing big cracks form, but I'm using small rolling motions and I keep rotating the dough. You never want to push the pin over the edge of the dough because that'll just adhere it right to your work surface. You can give it a flip, give it a rotate. And I'm using the angle on the French style of pin to coax that round shape as much as I can. And we're going to roll this to about 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters thick. But it's pretty easy to see that it'll fit the pie shell. And you want to factor in a little pastry hanging over the edge. All right, I can roll and talk at the same time. I love that when he says I do get emotional about my pastry. I love making pastry. It is my favorite, I think, after all. Oh, the first person to comment was Cherry on this feed asking about keeping fruits from browning or drying out. So if you're assembling a tart and it's being topped with fruit, the easy pastry chef trick is to glaze it with a clear jelly or jam. So you have a couple options. You can use apricot jam, which has a nice yellow color. You want to heat it up to a full simmer, add a couple tablespoons of water, strain out the chunks of apricots, and you can brush that on top. Or if you have access to apple jelly, and you just warm it up and use a pastry brush and brush it on top, and it seals in the fruit so it stays nice and bright. It won't turn brown. You can use lemon juice if you don't want to put a jam coating on top, or a little citric acid if you can get your hands on any. So when you peel and process your fruit, you just toss it with that powdered citric acid. And for fruits like fresh apple and pear slices, it'll keep them bright for a while. Okay, so you can see, any cracking is just minimal and inconsequential. And you can even see that sort of wave of flat butter? That's under the flour. So that's going to give us a nice little lift. It's these thin sheets of butter within the pastry that when they hit the heat of the oven, poof up, souffle, the water evaporates and pushes up those thin layers of flour. And that's what's giving us this flaky crust. And that's what the lemon juice is doing as it's baking, is it's ensuring it stays tender and flaky. So I just roughly toss that into my pie shell. Got a nice little overhang. Now here's another great tip, and this applies to any fruit pie you're making. Not a cream pie, but a fruit pie. A couple tablespoons of rolled oats, if you can spare them. Just a couple tablespoons. This creates an absorbing barrier so that when you put your wet filling on top, when that pie goes in the oven, the oats are going to absorb any juices that come out of the fruit pie first, giving your pie crust a chance to set. So strawberry rhubarb, apple, any of the cooked fillings, this is a great idea. I should touch on at the same time, so many things to cover. Blind baking your pie crust. So if you're making a cream pie or a lemon meringue pie filling, anything with a pre-cooked filling that you don't then bake afterwards in the pie shell, you need to do what's called blind baking. And that means you take your pie shell, you make it like this, you create a nice crimped edge. Then you chill the shell for about 20 minutes while you preheat your oven. Then what you need to do is you line it with foil. And I always put 2 sheets just in case it tears. And you need to weigh down the pie shell. You have to make it imagine there's a filling in there so it holds its shape. That can be raw rice, it can be raw beans. You can, if you have pie weights, I just tend to use raw rice, and you can reuse that rice. I just keep it in a jar or a bag to use again the next time I bake a pie. You bake it for a good 20 minutes at 400 degrees with the weights on, and then you use the edges of the foil to lift it off, and you bake it another 10 minutes to fully bake the pie crust. Then you can put any filling in, and you're set to go. So now we'll spread our peaches. This is the cooled peaches into the pie shell. And don't be afraid to get creative. I sometimes like adding a little splash of vanilla or a pinch of cinnamon to my fruit filling. If you had half a cup of fresh raspberries, you could just stir those right in too. That won't mess with your sugar ratio liquid volume at all, but it adds a nice pop of color. Peak summer, oh, peach blackberry is one of my favorites. So now you have two options. You can do a straight flat crust to cover the peach filling, but we're going to go through making a lattice top to this fruit pie. So this is where I didn't remember before. I'm just turning a square out of my circle a little bit so it's easier to roll, because I want lattice little ribbons of dough that are all about the same size to weave into this lattice top crust. If you don't feel you want to take on the lattice top, then you roll this out to the same thickness as your base dough. And then you put it on top. You can, oh, see here, oh, here's a great, if you can zoom in, Michael, this is what I mean. If you start rolling and you start seeing these little cracks form, this is where flipping the dough over, and then cracks, what cracks? They're all gone. What's important, if you're doing a single sheet of pastry on top of your fruit filling, you have to snip or cut out a few holes to vent the fruit. That way you don't get the steam from the fruit pushing up the crust, creating a separation or a gap. So as you can see, I'm rolling this more into a square or rectangle shape. And I'm just checking, I want it at least as long as the widest edge, from edge to edge of the pie plate. And use as much flour as you need. This dough is not being re-rolled, so you don't have to worry about working too much flour into the dough itself. Isn't it nice to be told when it comes something to do with pie? Don't worry. No fear of pastry here. Okay, now that I've rolled the dough out, I can feel it softening up. We're having a nice warm weather day here. Straighten it up. If you do, oh, I did that with my finger. Just gonna paste that together. All right, I'm not sticking. And when I'm doing a lattice top, I try and roll the dough just a touch thinner than if I were doing a single crust top. And that's to factor in that with the weaving, you're doubling up on the thickness of the dough. So I don't even bother trimming the edges, but I will make the first cut will be just a little trim this way. You can use a pastry wheel, you can use a knife. We've got a fluted side, a plain side, but a knife, I'll admit, I don't use a ruler. You can use one if you want to be precise. And if you go online, oh my gosh, there are endless numbers of crust styles you can play with. The ones there are a lot of them that look great when they're unbaked, but don't always bake up as pretty. So avoid ones that create too much of a doughy top to your pie, because you'll find you won't get that nice crisp flakiness at the center of certain shapes. So I'm going to get a little varied here. I'm going to cut 2 thicker pieces. And then I'm going to do 2 little thin ones. And then the rest will just be in the middle. If you want to pull out your tape measure and figure how many of what width you can get, you go for it. I'm going to use this in case I need an end piece. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 medium strips, but it's the two big ones and two little ones I was after. Can you see what we're doing? Great. So now to do the lattice top, the first thing you do is lay your strips of pastry all in one direction. So it can be all vertical or all horizontal. So I'm going to take care of that one first. And the reason I wanted to do a skinny one is just to give the pastry a little twist. So you can see how flexible it is. It's not cracking or breaking. If at any point, if you get through this point and you find, oh, my pastry dough is warmed up too much, it's starting to bruise and damage as I touch it, well, you can use, if you can roll it up onto a baking tray, pop it into the fridge, let it cool down a little bit, just whatever it takes to build your comfort and confidence. And I'm going to do 2 strips here, 1 strip there. Okay, and now it's time to start weaving. So let's start with this side. We're going to start on one side. So pull back, alternating pieces just by a couple inches. And this is where we're going to drop in 1 piece of pastry, like so. And then you fold it back over. Your little twisted one, you might have to retwist a bit. Now, that's the only one you're going to add this way. Now, the rest of the pie you build going in this direction. So wherever your last pastry sits on top, that's the one you fold back and fold back. And we'll drop in this nice big one. You can shimmy and shift them around a little bit if you need to. And now you alternate. So wherever your pastry sits on top and your last fold, that's the one you peel back. Now to make this look proportionate, we'll put another little twisty one here. And then just loosely, I'm not pressing too hard. You don't want it to stick at this point in case you do need to move things around a little bit. And then back and back. You will find that when you make a lattice top pie crust, you'll end up with some extra pie dough at the end. Because you've rolled it this thinly and you have all these gaps within, you'll find that you will have extra dough. So save that because you can use those scraps to roll and make a galette or a savory tart later. I think I'll put this last one right overlapping the edge. Okay. Give our twist, another little extra twist here. So at this point, I don't have a lot of scrap pastry left, but once I trim it. Now you don't really need an egg wash here, but I'm just gently pressing the lattice top around the outside edge. I find when it comes to a lattice top crust, because you've got the base crust and in some places 2 layers of pastry on top, I don't do a crimped edge because it just ends up being too much dough. But the easy way to trim your pastry at this point is to actually hold the pie upright from the bottom. If you feel better, you can do it working downwards, leaving the pie in place, but I find it easier. And just with a knife, trim off that excess. I'm trying to keep the knife away from the fruit filling so I don't add any color or get any fruit on top of the pie. And with that, you get a nice, clean looking crust. And so this dough, now that it has been rolled once, has to rest and chill again. So you can't do anything with it right now, but in another 2 hours, I could roll this and put in a zucchini ricotta filling with some fresh basil and lemon. I could put some Parmesan cheese in it. I can take this filling and use it in a galette style, meaning you roll it out, you put the whole disc on a baking tray, and then fold loosely, roughly. It's supposed to be rustic over the edges. But with any fruit pie, I do like to brush with a little egg wash. So just a little lightly whisked egg. It takes a little more time with the lattice top because you want to make sure you get full coverage in every little twist and turn and weave. This just promotes nice browning. You can omit it if you wish. It won't compromise the end result, but you won't get that shine. And if you wanted to, you could add a little sprinkling of coarse sugar, cinnamon sugar, or white sugar on top. It adds a nice bit of crunch. All right, there we go. Oh, good question. Kaz is asking, what about palmiers to make using this pie dough? Palmiers are traditionally made using puff pastry dough, so you might not get that kind of real palm leaf curl look to them, but you could certainly do a twist, or a cheese twist would be great. Brush it with butter, roll it out, brush it with butter, sprinkle Parmesan or cinnamon sugar, cut into strips, just like we did the lattice, and then bake those. And they'll be flaky, just not as flaky as a palmier, but that's a really good question. Oh, that's so funny. Diego says you can hear the ticking of my clock because I'm so focused. Sometimes I remember to take the clock down, but I forget sometimes. I realize I missed a spot here. So I do like to put a fruit pie on a baking tray because I have cleaned spilled over fruit on the bottom of my oven far too many times. What's key now is you need that hot oven. This is all about getting that pie crust set. So you preheat your oven to 400 degrees and you put the pie in, and at 10 minutes, then you turn down the heat to 375. So you got that set going, and it'll take a little time for the oven to cool down, and the pie will cook an additional 40 minutes. So a good fruit pie takes at least 50 minutes to bake. Pop this in. There we go. So yes, it's true. We won't be able to see that exact pie come out of the oven because it will take 50 minutes. But the good news is I baked you one already. And just to let everyone know, in case you're curious, if you've joined me for any of these Oh Yum 101 series before, none of the food I make, even though it's done in stages, goes to waste. What can be frozen is frozen. I've got some quite content neighbors and friends who get deliveries, but because we're not doing TV production in that larger scale, what you see me produce is what I produce. So I don't overproduce, and I always do save a little for us to snack on and enjoy too. Actually, freezing brings up a very good point. When to freeze a fruit pie? I find that once you get to the fully assembled pie, but it's unbaked, that is the best time to freeze it. Glass pie plates are tempered glass, so they can handle being put in the freezer. And then what is best is you pull out that pie a good day and a half before you want to serve it, and thaw it gradually in the fridge, then get it in the oven. You don't want to put a frozen pie in the oven because the center may not get cooked by the time the outside pastry gets cooked, and the shock of going from freezer to oven is not smart for your pie plate. But yes, freezing an unbaked pie is perfectly doable, especially with a cooked filling like this, because it won't let out any more juices. You've already cooked them away. So let's take a peek. Here we go. The exact same pie recipe that I baked off this morning. A good fruit pie takes at least 2 hours to cool down. So give it time, and it really depends on the fruit. How are you? I like most of my fruit pies chilled. So peach, cherry, blueberry, raspberry, I like them ice cold. But an apple pie, I don't mind when it's a little bit warm. But let's cut into this one just to see what we have. Everyone's doing well? Oh, here are some more questions. Can we use fresh mangoes instead of peaches? I love that idea. If you have access to those mangoes, because they have the same color and they have a beautiful sweetness to it, the only thing I would give a taste to, mangoes may have less acidity than peaches. So maybe a splash of lime juice would just wake up the fruit a little bit and then actually make the mango taste better. But as you know, mangoes cook beautifully. So I think that would be a fantastic fruit pie. We just don't have the luxury of fresh mangoes around here, do we? All right, now I'll take one more question. Do you like the way I'm building the suspense here? Peach pie. Well, Umar, we're gonna see if this pie is crispy. That's my pressure right now, and I've got butterflies in my stomach over this. Some great. Oh, Jayla asked a very good question. What about canned peaches? And I have had a few of you write me about that before. I would say yes, you can use canned peaches because kind of like the frozen ones, they've been blanched and peeled. Try and buy canned peaches with a light syrup. Don't rinse them, but drain them really, really well. And then still go back to this process of creating your own slightly caramelized syrup as that way you're in charge of it. And it will get rid of any of that tinned peach character to it. Oh, the first slice is always the trickiest. There we go. So we don't have a puddle of juices, which I know is the big frustration for a lot of people. The bottom of the pastry is crisp and not soggy. That's what the oats did. And it should be tender and flaky. And you can probably hear me chewing right now. But there you have it, a nice clean slice. I know you were zooming in, Michael, so you could see the flakiness on the outside edge without it being too doughy. You know this is cooked all the way through. Let's see, we've got time for a couple last questions. You're asking great questions here. All right. Hello from Tottenham. Oh, great question, Trina, because this is Pie Dough 101. Can you use 50-50 butter and lard? Yes, you can use 50-50. The difference is butter melts at a lower temperature than lard or shortening, which is why it makes such a palatable pie crust because it just kind of melts and then you're left with that flaky pastry that just disappears and you're left with the fruit taste. Lard will give you less flake and you get a very tender crust, but it'll have a hint of a sandy texture, which is also very, very satisfying. So really, whatever your comfort level is, whether it's lard or shortening, I go for the all butter. But if you're just starting out making pastry, you could do that 50-50. But do try the vegetable oil trick if you're doing a butter pastry, because it really does make a difference. You're waiting for me to eat this pie, aren't you?
Can you ask if that's Breno from St. Catharines commenting?
Is that Breno from St. Catharines? All right. Oh, and very good clarification. Someone was saying that 400-degree oven is 400 Fahrenheit, which is 200 Celsius. And after the 10 minutes, you'd reduce the oven temperature to 190 Celsius. But don't go lower than 180. That's the equivalent of 350, because then all of a sudden more juices will come out of your fruit filling. So we've got a peach pie with some fruit intensity. Remember, we slightly caramelize them. We reduce the juices in with some sugar and cream. So this will taste nice and soft. We've got the crisp crust. Ooh. And that's why it's time for me to take a bite of pie now. I've been talking nonstop for an hour. Bakers, thank you so much for joining me. This broadcast of Oh Yum 101 will be posted in just a little while. I will make sure that TJ, our wonderful channel manager, gets the proportions for things like the strawberry rhubarb pie and the thickened blueberry and cherry fillings. So you will see them at the bottom of this video right here. So whether it's peach, apple, strawberry rhubarb, blueberry, cherry, I hope I've gotten you over your fear of pastry and that you jump on this, enjoy, and have a fun summer, or if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, winter, baking fruit pies. Cheers, everyone.